Welcome to the fastest daf in town. Today we're Masech this Menachot daf Lamed Beis. We are going to begin on the bottom of Lamed Aleph Amid Beis, 4 lines to the bottom. So Amar Rav Chelboy. Rav Chelboy says the Chazina lay Rav Huna. I observed with regard to Rav Huna the kairich la mi echad klapi shema, that when he had the mezuzah, he was rolling from echad toward the Shema. In other words, he was rolling it from left to right. This is how he had the mezuzah rolled up. So that, if you will, that when it ends up being completely rolled up, and you would open it up, the beginning of Shema would be there, and then kind of like a Megillah, Esther, it's the same way, and then you'd open it up until you'd finally get to the bottom, or to the end. In addition to that, and that's what Rashi says, that koiflo mitzad smoil mitzad yamin, that he would roll it up from left to right. Fine. And then it says, let's read the rest of this Rashi. Kishenicha bedalet v'hayu me'echad klapi shema shereish ashur shema Yisrael v'soifa Hashem Elokei Hashem echad v'hiskil l'koifla me'echad. Okay, so again, that's how he would do it, as Rashi basically explains there. And then the second thing is v'oisa parshiyoisa setumois. Now, Mezuzah has two paragraphs, it has Shema and it has V'hoim Shemoah. Now, when the first paragraph of Shema ends at the beginning of the line, a stuma means that the next paragraph of V'hoim Shemoah, we don't start on the next line, but it continues on the next line. There's a little bit of a gap between them, but it's still on the same line. So there is a gap to demonstrate that it's a new paragraph, but it's stuma in that we don't start on a new line, which will be a ptucha. Okay, so that is what he did when it comes to a mezuzah. To Meisvei, Amar Shemon Elazar, Amer Hayir Kaisva al duchsustus kamindaf. Now, when Rameir would write the mezuzah, he would use duchsustus kamindaf. And we're going to see on the next Omud, duchsustus, if you would take the hide and would split it, so you'd have the hide, which is like the epidermis, the outer part, and then the more inner layer. So the inner layer of the hide is what we call duchsustus, and he would write, as we're going to see, on the outside of the inner layer. Okay, that's what duchsustus is, and he wrote it kimin daf. It says Rashi kimin amud shebasfarim arucha v'katsara, basically in one column. As we continue along with Beis Amud Aleph, v'yisa revach milmala v'revach milmata. There was a little bit of space at the beginning, above and below. There was like these margins. V'yisa parshiyos tumois, and this is the key word, that when he made the parshas between paragraph 1 and 2, he didn't start V'hoim Shemoah on the same line, but rather he waited, he skipped to the next line. So Amarti loy, so I said to him, Rabbi, matam, what's the reason why? Why did you make it psuchos? Ramali said, Hoyel ve'ein smuchos minatayra. It's one thing, let's say, for example, Parshas Vayechi, right? So Vayechi is, normally there's psuchos by each separate Parsha Tashavua, not by Vayechi, as Rashi over there explains, but you could at least, it makes sense because it's the next section. When we take a mezuzah, Shema and V'hoim Shemoah are not taken from the one right after the other. One is in Parshas Veschan and one's in Parshas Ekev, right? So they're not. There's a bunch of stuff in between in the Sefer Torah. So therefore, to demonstrate that they're not really close to one another, it makes sense that it should not be stumos, it should be psuchos. V'yamar Rav Chananel Amar Rav Halacha Rav Shimon ben Elazar, my love of psuchos. So the halacha is like this, that when it comes to writing mezuzah, it should not be a stumos, it has to be psuchos. It's a kasha. Lo, a revach. It just means the space, the margins. When it comes to the margins above and below, that's where he says the halacha is. There's a margin above and below. So the kama revach, how much space should there be? So Rav Menachot bar Yaakov v'Yarmul Asam, who was Omer Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak, kamali afta de sifri. So Rashi says that's 8 saduk hanoishe dape kuntrus shel yichpelu. So it was this type of wood that was put by the by notebooks, on pages of notebooks, so that it doesn't double over. So basically, it's possible that the parchment can fold, right? Because it's all like one thing, and it's going to wrap up, and you're trying to write it, and it can all fold up. So you would have almost seems like a paperweight or something like that to hold it so that it would not fold. So obviously, you don't want that on the actual words themselves, so you put it on a place where there's no words, which would be the margin, and therefore that's the amount. Amalei Abaye Rav Yosef, the Adlo Tispura, you don't hold the Chiyam Rav Revach, that when he said it's talking about the margins, Vaharav Islay Min Haga, but he has this custom, in the Nahig Alma Bestumais, and the minhag is to do it Bestumais, right? So that's how it should be done, not Psuchais. Yama Rabba, Omer Rav Kahana, Omer Rav, Im Yav Eliyahu, because if Eliyahu Hanavi comes, a good question to ask. You can ask a whole bunch of questions which are tekus. So if you have the chance to ever see Eliyahu, V'yomer Chalutzin b'Menachot, and he talks about the various dinim. When it comes to doing chalitza, can you use a nal shoe? So Shaimin lo ein chalitza bin sandal, and he says you cannot do chalitza with a sandal in Shaimin lo. You don't have to even listen to Eliyahu Navi. Shikar nago b'sandal, which is pretty unbelievable. Even if Eliyahu Navi comes and he says something, so that's it. Doesn't make any difference. We don't have to listen to him because we already are naig that we do use a sandal. We could use a sandal for the ceremony of chalitza. Rav Yosef, Omer Rav Kahana, Omer Rav, Im Yav Eliyahu v'Yomer in chalitza b'minal. If he would say that chalitza cannot be done with a nal, shemin lo, then we would listen to him. In chalitza b'sandal, if he says don't use sandal, in shemin lo shekvar nago b'sandal, because our custom is to use a sandal and not a nile. Okay, so good. So it's whether you can use a nal lechatchila or only b'diavad. It says Rashi. According to the opinion that said that if Eliyahu Navi comes and says you could use a nal, then shaymin loy, we can listen to him. Ksavar min nal hashdol chatchila loy ad shiad she'aviyav v'yara. According to the other one, it says Im Yav Eliyahu v'Yomer ein chayetz min nal. He says do not use a nal. Shaymin lo, listen to him b'chlal ad she'av Eliyahu until he comes. V'yomer lo tichatzenu b'minayel chayotzin. Okay, so until he says no, you could do it. Okay. Anyway, so that's the nafkamina. But why are we bringing this down? So v'amrina ben so el olav shmamina arevach shmamina. We clearly see that the whole discussion is on the revach, on the space, as it was already brought down. Okay, fine. Because again, as we see that even if Eliyahu Hanavi would come and say that we're noig to do stomais, right? Even if he would tell us that, it doesn't really matter because we follow what our tradition is. Our minhag is stomais. So whatever he says, we don't necessarily have to listen to what he says. We follow the minhag. So the fact that he says psuchais, halacha is not like that because we don't do it that way. We do stumas. Okay. What it really means over here is that the better way to do it, to make it sosum, as we saw was what Rav Huna did. However, v'i of the dinhu psuchais shaper dami. If instead you would do psuchais, then it would still be okay. So my psuchais, dekaimer, what does that mean? Dekaimer Rav Shimon Melezer, psuchais. It just means that also this is acceptable. It doesn't mean it must be psuchais, right? It just means that you could do it this way, right? And that's what it means. So when Rav Shimon Melezer said, the Rameir said, had his mezuzah on duchsustus, and he would write it with margins, and it was psuchos, it doesn't mean it had to be psuchos, because we really do stumos. It just means it could be psuchos. Let's say all of this, we have a proof. What's that? Sefer Torah. So too, when it comes to the din of Sefer Torah, shabalu v'tefillin shabalu. So if you have a Sefer Torah, which is obviously the highest level of kedusha, and you also have tefillin, which is also a very high level of kedusha, which has more kedusha even than a mezuzah, because the mezuzah only has 2 parshios, tefillin has 4. So what do you do if some of it's, you can't really use the Sefer Torah, you can't use the tefillin, but there are some parts of it which are still able to be used if we would remove it. So you can't take, let's say, a beautiful paragraph from the Sefer Torah and cut it out and use it for a mezuzah. Even though it's the same, but since it was part of a Sefer Torah, which is considered kedusha chamura, you can't lower it down. It's the same thing for the tefillin. So what is that mashma? Maridin. The only reason why you can't do it is because there's a din of it can't be demoted. But if that rule didn't apply, Yutaka could still do it. Now, the mezuzah was psucha. Okay, so what does that mean, right? So how do we understand that? As Rashi says, hachas stumos the Sefer Torah. In the Sefer Torah, it's written as a stuma. The hacha psuchais b'mezuzah. So el shma mina b'mezuzah nami stumos hein. In the Sefer Torah, it's definitely stumos. The question is, when it comes to mezuzah, is it also stumos, or it's also psuchais? So if it's psuchais, so how can you use these paragraphs, because the way it's written is not the same? The answer is v'dilma lahashlim. What does that mean? The mezuzah really was psucha, right? How is that possible? The Sefer Torah is stumos, so they're not the same the way it's written. But a line was missing from the mezuzah, and if not for the issue of maridin, they could sew in a line from a complete Sefer Torah to the mezuzah. That's all it means, right? It says Rashi, it doesn't mean the whole paragraph, but maybe just like one line, so you could put that in there. If you could, taka, as we said, it wasn't for that issue of demoting the sanctity of Sefer Torah to mezuzah, you could, apparently that would still work. But what do you mean? The parchment is completely different parchment. Vasanyim, let's say from tefillin to mezuzah. Vasanya halacha moshe mesinai tefillin al haklaf, mezuzah al duchsustus. So what is klaf? So again, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, when you take the hide, the outer part of the hide, the outer layer is called klaf, which you just call parchment, and that's what we use for tefillin. When it comes to the inner part of the cloth, of the parchment rather, of the hide, that is the inner part, the inner layer is called the chsustus. So when it comes to the outer layer, that's for tefillin. The inner layer is for mezuzah. So obviously the question is, how could you possibly take something from the tefillin and use it for a mezuzah? The din is it has to be on different types of parts of the hide, right? So that's the question over here. Halacha mishmisin tefillin al klab mezuzah al dechsustus. Klab b'makam basar. The dechsustus is b'makam seir. So the klaf, which is again the outer part, so when you write it b'makam basar, on the inner part of the outer layer. Dechsustus, which is the inner layer, you write it b'makam seir, which is the outer part, right? So which means you write, interestingly enough, either mezuzah on dechsustus or the tefillin on klaf on the part that was once, they were both touching at one point, and when you separated it, you write over here and over here for tefillin and mezuzahs respectively. But the question is, so how could you possibly think that this is acceptable? You're not allowed to even use this type of a parchment. I mean, it's only a mitzvah. It's not ma'akev. V'sanya shina psul. It says if you make a difference, it's possible. Yeah, but tefillin, that just means only by tefillin, right? If you look in this Rashi, v'sanya shina psul mishani b'tefillin kamari, and Rashi continues on Amud Beis. The im kosvan dichsustus. If you would use dichsustus for tefillin, then it would be possible. But the other way around, of a mezuzah, a klaf, shabradami. You could actually take tefillin, which is written on klaf, and use that for mezuzah. So that's where answer is. So that sounds great, but it's not true. Mosanya shina ben bezeh posel. It's a two-way street. So you can't use dichsustus for tefillin. Okay, we established that. But you also can't use klaf for mezuzah. So tefillin. So really, we're talking about both of them are referring to tefillin. Baha de kasvinu a klaf b'makam seir. One is, again, the tefillin you're supposed to use klaf. One is you wrote it b'makam seir, which is on the outer part, which is not what you're supposed to do for tefillin, but b'makam seir is for dichsustus. Baha, as we continue on with Beis, de kasvinu a dichsustus b'makam basar. The other one is where it means you wrote on dichsustus b'makam basar in the inner part. So it doesn't mean that you changed for tefillin, which is klaf, and used it for mezuzah. That is allowed. What's not allowed is when you use tefillin for klaf, it has to be on the inner part, not the outer. When you use dichsustus for mezuzah, it has to be the outer part and not the inner part. That's what it means. That's the shina. Okay, that's one answer. The Hebrew is saying alternatively, shina bezeh bezeh tanoihi. Actually, it's just a machlokas tanoim whether it's an issue. Desanya shina bezeh bezeh posel. Rav Acha Makshir Mishum Rabbi Acha b'Rabbi Chanina. Yermol some say was Mishmei the Rabbi. Kiva b'Rabbi Chanina. Hamaridin. Fine. So it's a machlokas tanoim. Okay. Let's look at question 5b, which kind of is only partially here, but it is also elsewhere, which those are the more difficult types of questions. And the question number 5b asks is, what is this margin when it comes to Ma'oshir Revach Sheishel Haniach Begil Yanais Sefer Torah Mezuzos Mimal Ksav. So we said on a previous daf that for Sefer Torah has to be Gimel Etzba'is on the top. There's be 3 fingers above. That's the margin for Sefer Torah. That doesn't say on our daf. It's on the previous daf. However, over here it's mezuzah kamoli atav d'tzafri. Says Rashi. The Rambam says it's kamol chatzi sipoidin. It's like half of a fingernail, right? So again, it's a very small amount. But again, it has something to do with like maybe something which holds the paper, but it's a very small amount, as the Rambam explains. Okay. All right, question 6 as well, I think we did. Yeah, so question 6. Eo devarim huskru besugin shenikvu halacha. That's the halacha because that's what our custom is, right? So we said by 2 things. We said, first of all, when it came to the mezuzah, that when we write the mezuzah, it's stumos, as we explained. The second paragraph is on the same line as the first. And also, when it comes to the dinim of chalitza, shekfar nagu ha'am b'sandal, or minhag is to use sandals, and not nal, and therefore that is the exception. Okay. All right, let's keep on moving. Okay. So actually, this is a great question, TA11. Very hard question, actually, because you have to hold cup for this. I got it all right, which is pretty amazing. It says, Sefer Torah Shabal, but Tefillim Shabalu, Ein Oisim Hen Mezuzas, Lefi She'ein Moridin. So Gemara asks, Mashma, otherwise it could be Moridin. So he said, so what were the 3 questions? So one has to do with, as we said, klaf in the sustus, right? So that's going to be one answer, which is, again, this is TA 11, okay? So that's going to be one answer. And now we're going to get into, that's actually the second answer. The first one, as we said before, is one is stumois and one is psuchais, right? Let's just find this. So one question is because one is written stumois and one is psuchais. Sefer Torah is stumois and mezuzah psuchais, right? And the other one is the question about the klaf. Is it klaf or is it dochsustus? Okay. Let's keep on moving. So now we're going to get to our third question, which will be TA 11. Another distinction. So he says like this. Right? Diamarav min Yomi bar Chilki Amarav Chama bar Guri Amarav Komuzos Shin Mesaretas Psula. When it comes to a mezuzah, it needs sirtut, but tefillin does not need sirtut l'chayra. So Rabbi min Yamin bar Chilki Didei Aimer sirtut shel mezuzah hachamash mesinai. So the question is, if that requires sirtut and the tefillin didn't require sirtut, so then how do we understand? Why would you otherwise think you could use it? Right? Doesn't make sense. As Rashi says, but tefillin lo ashkachan deboy sirtut. We have never found anywhere that tefillin requires sirtut. So that's the third part. So that's the kasha. So tanohi, it's actually a machloikis tanohi. Design Rabbi Yomi Omer Misham Rabbeinu tefillin mezuzah nichtava shlo min eksav. First of all, if you're an expert cipher, so you've written so many tefillin mezuzahs, you know it so well, and therefore you don't need to actually look at it because it's obvious. You know the words. You don't need another sefer Torah to be able to know it because you just know it by heart. Which we're going to see in a second. Ve'en sricha sirtut, but tefillin don't need sirtut, but even mezuzah doesn't need sirtut. However, hilchos tefillin lo boy sirtut, mezuzah boy sirtut. So again, we see that that would be a machlokas tanaim. Otherwise, it would be a pretty strong, valid question. Which question 14, TB 14, a little bit of a different question over here. So he says. Im tefillin mezuzah srichen sirtut. So does it need sirtut or not? So this is always our hard questions because you can say, well, the tefillin, it says the halacha is that tefillin does not need sirtut, and mezuzah needs sirtut. So they probably want you to write the mezuzah as a machlokas. I wrote tefillin lo boy sirtut v'yesh machlokas b'gemara al zeh. There's no machlokas about tefillin. That's not true. Mezuzah sarach sirtut halacha. V'yesh cholkin v'ein sarich sirtut. So I got a little bit confused. Everyone holds tefillin does not need sirtut. Machlokas is how about by mezuzah. The individual nichtav shalom neksav. But someone who's writing tefillin mezuzahs did not need to look at it. My time in migras grisen, which I always find so fascinating. This Gemara. Which is also found in Masechta Shabbos and other places. So Rashi says, "Rohutim him befi kol adam." It's something which every person, kol adam, everyone knows. V'in toyin mehen hilkach in sarch lakim b'sefer acher. You don't need to look at another sefer Torah. It doesn't say. Maybe you could at least help this generation. Like, what do you mean they know it? Okay, Shema v'hoyim shemoa. Okay, maybe you know every word. Kaddish li. V'haya keviacha from Parshas Bo. Do people know that by heart so well? It's unbelievable. Maybe it's talking about a sofer, right? A sofer stam knows it, but that's not what Rashi says. It says mefi kol adam, everyone. It's unbelievable. Okay. All right. Amar Rav Chelbo ana chazite Rav Huna. So this is again how we started, right? I saw Rav Huna, right? Amar Rav Chelbo chazite Rav Huna. So this is another observation. Dahavi Yosef Apuri the Sefer Torah. Well, he actually was sitting on the same bed where there was a Sefer Torah, which is pretty hard to imagine. The Kafla Kada Aara, the Anachaleha. So what did he do? So again, there was a sefer Torah. The Havi Yosef Apori the Sefer Torah. The Kafla Kada Ara, that he went to the ground, and he removed it first. The Sefer Torah Hadi Yosef B'mita. In other words, not that he did it, but he wanted to. So he took some type of item, and he put the Sefer Torah on it. Since Rashi Lafi Shahaya Sefer Torah Munach al Roisha Vayroitzel Yoshev al Mita. He wanted to sit on the bed. So that's what he did. He removed the Sefer Torah. He obviously holds you can't sit in the same place as the Torah. The plea of the Rabbi Bar Chana, and Rabbi Bar Chana, and Rabbi Yochanan, Motli Yeshav al Gabi Mita, Sefer Torah Munachal. It's actually machlok. If someone quietly says, "I, my son Rabbi Lezer, Shahayu Yeshav al Mita," there was a story that Rabbi Lezer, he was sitting on a bed, and he remembered there was a Torah there. And all of a sudden he sat on the ground. So we see clearly that's not a good idea. It almost looked like he was like smitten or bit by a snake. Says Rashi, what does that mean? Miroiv tsar. She wasn't comfortable on the ground, but obviously he would have much been more comfortable sitting on a bed, but he didn't do it. So apparently it's because it's usher. Right? So no hasam sefer Torah al gabi karka havoy. The sefer Torah would have been on the ground. What does that mean? So there's different ways of interpreting this. So Rashi says haya sefer Torah mushlach dika bizyoni yisero kachnit sta'er. So by putting it on the ground, that would have been a greater level of bizayin, and that's the element of tsar, right? That's how some people read this. And look in Taisus, nearer the halacha Rav Yochanan Gabi Rav Huna Nefil Gabi Rav halacha Maisu. Okay. And he quotes the Yerushalmi. It says in Perak Mishamesu Masachtas Brachos, it says Teva Shehi Malay Sfarim, that if you have a teva which is filled with Sfarim, nice Rosh Hamita, you can put it on the top of the bed. Then a nice Margolius. It shouldn't be by the foot of the bed. And it says Vahu Shitehei Mita Gavoya Asar Tfachim. The bed should at least be 10 Tfachim high. Glohi Ragli Hamita Noigin Bateva, and the feet of the bed shouldn't be touching it, right? So Oid Kaimer al Lo Yeshiv Adam al Gabi Safsel. It also says you're not supposed to sit on a bench. Etc. Im Hoya Nasan al Gabi Davar Acher. If let's say it's on something else, right? You have like it's not on the same level right next to you. It's on some other level. Ad Kama. So he says Tefach or Koshu, even the smallest amount. Ad Kam.